Okay, that took a while to get set up, but here we go. So today we're going to have a look at trauma, especially intergenerational trauma, and how that affects you. We're going to be looking at a journal article that discusses this. So for today, we're just going to be reading the journal article, and in a later video, we're going to be analyzing it. So this journal article is called After the Catastrophe, Working with the Intergenerational Transmission of Collective Trauma in Jungian Analysis. The content of this could potentially be triggering because if you look in the abstract, if you can see what it says, that it's mentioning us impact of traumas from survivors of the Holocaust, Stalin's gulags, China's Cultural Revolution. So some fairly serious topics that we've got here. And if you're not interested, this might not be a good video for you. So I'm going to read through the abstract. The psychological emotional impact of the collective traumas and psychic catastrophes of the Jewish Holocaust, Stalin's Gulag, and China's Cultural Revolution upon the second and third generation of survivors in the US, China, and Russia. They say it's explored through the lens of Jungian analysis and infant observation. Parent-infant interactions that may indicate that the intergenerational transmission of trauma is taking place will be explored. That just means that there is trauma somehow stored in the genes of parents, and the children inherit those genes. And specifically, it has to do with the markers on how the genes are expressed. So we have lots of genes in our DNA, and a lot of the time, most of those genes aren't expressed, and they used to be called junk DNA. And now we know that a lot of it's not junk DNA. It's just waiting for certain factors in the environment to help those DNA markers be expressed. And how this works, if we want to look at the actual mechanism, is that the DNA unwinds itself. So the DNA is wound up. It's folded and arranged in a specific way. So to be expressed, it has to unwind. So these markers will cause certain sections of the DNA to be unwound and replicated. Analytical and infant observation research indicate that trauma can be transmitted from one generation to the next, often unconsciously, and that's an important point, and that the impact of collective trauma creates tears and holes. So we're using quite strong language here. This has a widespread impact, not only on individuals, but also on society as a whole. And people ask, why is society so messed up? Well, it's because we've got tears and holes in the psyches, in the social fabric, in the structure caused by trauma. And that the impact of collective trauma creates tears and holes in the emergent cultural and personal psychic skins of the infant that can impede the development of a coherent individual identity. Okay, that's interesting. This is affecting identity, as well as secure attachment relationships. You might have heard about attachment styles, and I'm seeing lots of videos on attachment styles, and this is something that we're more aware of now and is definitely a hot topic and readily applied to a lot of people. These tears and holes in the cultural and personal psychic skins can later become the focus of analysis in the second and third generation of survivors. So they're looking at the second and third generation of survivors that they've traced back. And this is because this is what they're able to study, which is actually quite impressive. It's difficult to find cases to study, but it's likely that it can go back even further. Analysis can become a space for both collective personal mourning and healing as coherent, symbolic, historical, and personal narratives are co-constructed and integrated within the analytical temenos. So we're not going to worry about that word temenos there. We're just going to focus on there is healing that's possible. There is a way to integrate and understand what you're experiencing, especially when what you're experiencing in your life, you might have signs of trauma, but not understand why. We can see a lot of people will have these signs of trauma that show up in their behavior that we've normalized. But recognizing that it is a sign of trauma and that we can heal from it, we can grow from it, we can essentially move the standard for normal to a new normal. There's so much in this last sentence here. So they're talking about the narratives and how important the narratives are, because the narratives of what we come from, they deeply affect us. And we can create new narratives around that, where it's not just I'm weird and there's something wrong with me, but this is what's happened in my generational lineage and this is how it's affecting me. And that creates coherence. There isn't that sense of confusion, of lack of ability to enact action, a feeling of helplessness, lack of control. And that's why creating this coherent story of why you're experiencing what you're experiencing can be very helpful. And that brings up, why am I bringing up this journal article? Why can't I just say this concept? The important thing is that this healing, it takes place physically, takes place on an emotional and psychological level. It takes place within the very complex system of our bodies and our minds. We've got this level of the subconscious where we have all these beliefs stored. We've got our DNA. We have all these complex systems that if we're going to heal, it's going to take some kind of energy that's going to create that healing. And using your mind to understand what's going on can be really helpful in that process and aiding that process, because your body naturally wants to heal, but the mind can get in the way. It can get in the way of judgments, feeling bad. Like, why am I experiencing this? And that's why this is so important, because science is the new religion. Science is the religion of our modern society. And we don't realize that. We don't realize the subconscious hold that science has on our beliefs, on our belief systems. So that's why I'm bringing up science here, because by reading this article, understanding it, and using the inherent belief system that we have with our faith, that we have in science, because science is not perfect, but we have this inherent belief in science. Scientists are essentially the new priests of our society. We can make use of that to help us with this healing process. It's basically another tool. We're getting the mind online. So there's practices you can use with your body to help you to heal. And then also getting your mind online too is really helpful, because then you can see, wow, this is really important. And you can make this an important, integral part of your daily life. The more we learn, the more we know, the more we can understand ourselves and this system, this body that we are living in. And that's why I think science can be super helpful. So the keywords: cultural revolution, Holocaust, transgenerational trauma. Oh, no, don't want that. So we've read the abstract. We can see this is 14 pages long. And one of the things that you want to do when you're studying or reading is go over it, do a look through, and that's going to help solidify what you're learning. So we're just going to go through, have a look through, look at any pictures or read the captions. So this is quite text heavy. And it looks like there's quite a few stories in here as well. So there's 14 pages, but we can already see that some of it is not in English. So we have about 10 pages. In After the Catastrophe, written in 1945, Jung states about his attitude towards Nazi atrocities that, "I must confess that no article has ever given me so much trouble, from a moral as well as human point of view." Jung's use of the concepts of collective guilt and the collective shadow in regards to Nazi Germany can offer important insights also into the collective traumas of the Russian gulags, as well as offering a path towards investigating intergenerational trauma from the standpoint of analytical psychology. I would like to explore the psychological, emotional impacts of these collective traumas and psychic catastrophes of the Jewish Holocaust, Stalin's gulags, and China's Cultural Revolution upon the second and third generation of survivors in the US, China, and Russia. So the author is sharing some of their personal experience as a second generational survivor of the Jewish Holocaust. So this impacted the author quite a bit. We can probably assume that can be what motivated them to do this kind of work in the first place. And they mentioned how it has impacted their own identity development as a Jungian analyst and another kind of analyst. It has been fundamental to be able to reflect coherently upon the transmission of Holocaust trauma within their own family, to be able to work effectively with cultural trauma, both within the context of their discipline of observing infants and in clinical analysis with children, adolescents, and adults. So they previously worked as a personal analyst and supervisor of clinical work, and they have been studying and reflecting upon the intergenerational transmission of collective trauma. And in journal articles, there's going to be lots of extra language that they use to make sure they're very specific about what they're saying. We already see a little bit of this repetition here. In infant observations, as well as in the narratives that are often shared with the observer related to family history, and in analysis, these silent narratives often form the scaffolding of distorted perceptions of self and other. Okay. So they talk here about typical attachment patterns in infants. That's the first thing. The second thing is these narratives. I'm guessing that's stories that they've heard about their family history, but I'm not sure exactly what they mean here. They talk about silent narratives that form a distorted perception of self and other, and the impact the development of individuation and the formation of a coherent identity. So maybe they'll explain that a little bit more. So they pretty much repeat what we said in the abstract here. They're talking about the tears and holes. Okay, so we're going to be looking at some analysis of second-generation survivors of cultural trauma. Okay, so this person has been treating people who have suffered from personal and social trauma in the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. And that's interesting because in journal articles, you will see how you're going to be looking at journal articles from different people around the world, and the social context of the researchers who write those articles is going to be affected by the culture that they live in, the people that are around them. And essentially, you get a little bit of a lens into a different culture, into a different place around the world. So you can take away lessons, and you can also step into the environment and into the perspective of the person writing the article. So this person has done some pretty heavy lifting in terms of this work. Often these individuals have entered into analysis in order to work on the impact of trauma upon their current lives. I have found that as the trauma was elaborated in the context of a contained analytical relationship, it became apparent that difficulties forming and maintaining secure attachment relationships were evident. So they had trouble with relationships, especially committed long-term relationships. Often these individuals suffered from avoidant, ambivalent, and disorganized attachment relationships. So They experienced chaos in their lives because the ability to form a secure attachment provides a lot of stability, provides emotional support. Being able to form a connection and bond with someone who's also able to form that healthy emotional bond can make a huge, huge difference in your life. The trauma, which was elaborated in their analysis, had its origins in both the interpersonal childhood, adolescent, and adult histories of the person being analyzed, as well as in their relationships to the wider repressive and authoritarian cultures in which they lived. The light bulb just turned on for me. I had a ski coach who was Czechoslovakian, and yeah, he had some issues. There was this radical attitude and difficulty with interpersonal relationships on a professional level. So this affects your whole life. It just doesn't just affect your personal relationships, it affects your career. You've got relationships in every aspect of your life. So this is such a difficult challenge. And yeah, growing up, ski racing, and I think especially in my teens, there were these European coaches who were nuts. They were nuts. And I read that sentence and it just connected for me. It made sense. And this ski coach had a negative impact on my development as a teenager, unfortunately. Yeah. And I see this, especially with women in sports, that they'll have these male coaches who have this distorted perception. And like they will try to get the women to lose an unreasonable amount of weight, saying that it helps with performance when it's so damaging to their health, it actually reduces performance. That's just one example. I've seen, I think it was a runner, and I forget exactly which team she joined, but yeah, the coach just destroyed her health and her potential career. Wow. It's kind of, it's sad, yeah, because there is the personal responsibility involved, but also there's the aspect where they're suffering themselves. And then yeah, trauma just engenders more trauma. Okay, so they've got the trauma, and when they analyzed it, it affected their personal lives as well as their relationships to the wider repressive and authoritarian cultures in which they lived. And you will definitely see and notice the effects of that if you go to those places. Yeah, the effects are still present today. And because we live in a global world where this is really affecting everyone. The repressive culture became internalized as an inner persecutory presence. Ooh, I would call that the inner critic. So I'll start again from the beginning of that sentence. The repressive culture became internalized as an inner persecutory presence and led to feelings of pronounced suspicion, loneliness, and isolation. And if you feel that in your heart, if you feel that pain as you listen to what's being said, yeah, just have a bit of space for yourself for that. I can feel that. I can feel a bit of that pain in my heart. These individuals often reported feeling suspicious of others, were withdrawn in their relationships with the outer world, and exhibited difficulties in maintaining and sustaining intimacy in their personal lives. Oh, it makes me want to cry. So what happens here is that there's this suspicion and loneliness and isolation, and this is trauma from the past. And so even if there is no outside threat anymore, then there is still that internalized threat, and there's still that emotion that maybe has been repressed or suppressed and hasn't been processed. And so this affects your paradigms of reality. And so you can be really suspicious and cut yourself off and create this isolation for yourself because of this distorted perception. You can't fully live in the present and live in reality. And when you're in this state, the paradigms that are creating this suspicion and loneliness and isolation projected towards a lot of things that maybe aren't related. And it seems so real. It seems so real to the point where it's difficult to let go of it and to realize this is a trauma response, and I'm feeling the emotions of a trauma response, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everything in my environment is a threat that I have to guard against. So this is where it comes up, where I'm going to attack before I am attacked. And you'll have this aggressive attitude. Or I'm going to withdraw and leave before they withdraw. Wow. This is intense as promised. Yeah, they often reported feeling suspicious of others. Because if you're in danger, how can you trust anyone and anything? Were withdrawn in their relationships with the outer world and exhibited difficulties in maintaining and sustaining intimacy in their personal lives. And this is really, really challenging. As the origins of these difficulties were explored analytically, it became evident that a culture of suspicion, persecution, and terror pervaded their personal lives and formed the internal background for their personal and cultural complexes. Wow, okay. So let's say you grew up during a time period where there was war, where there was famine, where there was an incredibly dangerous situation that you were living in, that there wasn't access to money or food or resources. There was this poverty, and that affected you deeply, or maybe it affected your parents deeply. And so there can be this fear about not having enough. So then even in the present day, when you do have enough, that fear can continue. And I noticed this showing up in me, that even though I can provide for myself, adequately and fully, I still was in a pattern of having anxiety about money. And I was being anxious about money, but being anxious about worrying to buy a house, when I stepped back and realized, well, I'm not going to be able to buy a house next year or in 3 years, realistically. But even if I didn't buy a house, I can definitely afford rent. I can definitely afford to live in a beautiful place that I live in. So I have a lot of security. I don't have food scarcity at all. I have a really, really good life. And this is what prompted me. Oh, you know what? I am going to commit to releasing what I'm calling that as a poverty mindset or the scarcity mindset. It's just really these beliefs that are affecting how my subconscious beliefs are showing up in my thoughts. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to get rid of this. I'm not going to live like this because this is ridiculous. And it's being focused on that is preventing me from developing and growing myself into more abundance. Being able to really step into my potential as a person and being able to create and develop the things in my life that help myself and also help others in a really big way. So I'm working on a course. I'm calling it the Blissful Abundance Blueprint or something like that. And this is me working through that process and the process of that. So like stepping back and what's involved. So it's quite scary because there's this part of us that wants to stay in this survival mode, and that part has to be disassembled and have this almost ego death, which I can do. And I can reassure myself that it's okay. It's okay that you feel like this because you're safe. And I am safe. Okay, so back to the journal article. This picture is in my background is a picture of the library in Portugal. And I just think learning is so fun. It's so exciting. And being in a beautiful library is such a wonderful feeling. As the origins of these difficulties were explored analytically, so the difficulties where they're feeling suspicious of others, withdrawn in their relationships, weren't able to maintain and sustain intimacy, feeling suspicious, lonely, and isolated. As the origins of these difficulties were explored analytically, it became evident that a culture of suspicion, persecution, and terror pervaded their personal lives. So that's really what I'm talking about, is living in this fear when it's really not necessary. I understand, live in fear if that's your environment and that's what you need to survive. But as I mentioned, that's why I was creating this course, is to help combat that, because that survival system's not needed in the same way that it was. So these difficulties formed the internal background for their personal and cultural complexes. So complexes could be another word for limiting beliefs or limiting paradigms. Lingering anxieties related to the Holocaust pervaded all of the people analyzed who were of Jewish heritage. And of course, there's the terrifying memories and they were communicated transgenerationally at both conscious and unconscious levels. So that's really interesting, the unconscious part, because that's the part that we don't realize. And when spoken about in analytical sessions, filled the consulting room with a pervasive sense of terror. So the threat is gone, but the terror isn't. And that's awful. It's awful to live in terror. It affects your whole body. It affects your whole nervous system. In this respect, the analysis itself became a space of collective memory where cultural complexes, that's an interesting concept, the collective memory, where cultural complexes could be contained and worked upon in the safety of that space. Ooh, this is really interesting. The people who escaped clandestinely from Eastern Bloc Soviet-occupied countries realized in the course of analysis how they also carried the repressive and authoritarian cultures within themselves, and painfully realized that they were enacting persecutory fears both within their external lives as well as within the analytical transference. So transference could be they're transferring it onto the therapist. So person could be saying that as the therapist, they could have been experiencing these distorted perceptions of their patients being projected onto them. That could be what that means. But the big point here is that they started to embody some of the traits that they got from those repressive cultures and environments. And that's a survival mechanism. It's eat or be eaten. And I saw that within my ski coach, who was very controlling. Wasn't interested in having me learn how to think for myself in terms of my training in that context, but was just wanted to control everything, which is not healthy. Not healthy for children or developing young adults. It really hampers that growth and ability to take risks. Because if you don't feel safe, you can't take risks. Because the threat of failure could be death. Especially in this context. Oh, so rough. So, yeah, a lot of healing has to happen in this context, but the hardest thing is realizing that you need the healing. And of course, they realized it because of their personal problems. Like, that's why they came and showed up. I'm sure there's lots of people who don't realize that they need healing and don't show up. They carried the repressive and authoritarian cultures within themselves and painfully realized that they were enacting persecutory fears, both within their external lives as well as within the analytical transference. Yeah, so the author talks about his own struggle. The author talks about their own struggles with how, as a therapist, they can project certain things onto the client because they grew up with background in Jewish, Lithuanian, Latvian background. And mentions their own memories that were transmitted unconsciously or in hushed tones by the family. So I'm not sure what they mean by memories transmitted unconsciously. I'm not sure if that maybe means dreams of experiences that that person didn't have, but their parents or grandparents had. The intersection of cultural, social, and historical trauma between analyst and the person being analyzed became important and critical factors to reflect upon. And they talk about how the therapist and the patient were both deeply impacted by the work they were doing. Oh, okay, mention dreams. Progress could be made in these analyses as symbolization processes unfolded. Well, this person was doing work in the Jungian vein of thought, and Jung was very big on dreams. So these experiences could be expressed in dreams and memories and given some coherent narrative form. I would liken this process to the creation of an analytical theater where each of the internal characters has an important part to play and where each internal character needs to find their own unique voice. So we're talking about characters now. So the individual takes on characters within themselves that represent their environment, their parents, their society, their experiences. And these characters are reflected within themselves. And they can affect how you behave. So you can think about it as we have all these little split characters or split personalities within ourselves. And while we might not be diagnosed with a split personality disorder, if you pay a lot of attention, you can notice how these personalities show up. They will fight with each other with conflicting thoughts. That might stress you out. The critical voice, that can be a character. There's different aspects of yourself that can show up, and if you pay a lot of close attention to them, you'll notice how they have this two-dimensionality to them. They don't have this depth, because the depth comes from you as a person that is behind the facade of these characters. The key thing being is that these characters and their stories, they limit you. And if you can separate yourself and understand that the characters and how they act out isn't you, that can help. While you do need to take responsibility and accountability for your actions, there's a lot of shame and guilt that can be piled on top of everything by identifying with the character. So yes, there's integrity, there's accountability that has to happen in your life. But when you're working through the healing, there is a level of dissociation that you can have where you step back and see yourself as more than just this limited character. And this character can be an aspect of the survival mechanism. And because it is a survival mechanism, there isn't room to be your authentic, unique self, because being your authentic, unique self is scary, because it could get you unalived in those contexts. So this is a really interesting way to think about your internal self and your internal landscape as this play of these different characters. Okay. The intersection of two collective traumas, Vilnius and Odessa. Okay, according to Jung, the analyst's psychological maturation and individuation is fundamental in working with others. It's just important that you have a healthy therapist. In this regard, I have found in working with Jewish clients with Holocaust backgrounds that the working through and pronounced suspicion, loneliness, the working through an integration of their own familial trauma in the form of a powerful cultural complex has been important. So they talk about their own background and how people within their own family became historians. They say, I remember as a child looking with awe, terror, and dread at the numbers that they kept tattooed on their forearms. Yeah, that's too close for comfort. I had the feeling then that they were serving the function of keeping the memory of the dead ones alive so that there could be the possibility of mourning. Wow, at an early age, I began to realize that without memory, there can be no mourning. So they present this idea that if you are experiencing the effects of trauma, but you don't know what traumatized you, it's really, really difficult to heal from that because the mind doesn't have anything to grasp. Can't make sense of what's going on. And the mind is a part of ourselves, because we've got our mental body and emotional body and the mind, and also there's the spiritual body as well. And the mind does play an important part. So they talk about the trauma of the person who is their client. Oh, wow. I'm not going to read through all of this because this could be quite triggering. Wow, so that basically, to summarize that page, the experiences of terror, alienation, persecution, dread, and anxiety that emerged during their work together. So they worked together for 5 years, mostly 4 times a week. So that's intense. And I'm assuming that they had the money to pay for it. And this is where it's really important to become your own advocate, your own therapist, that so that you know how to get the resources that you need for help. Not everyone can afford that level of help. Yeah, so this person was fearful of not being understood by a non-Jewish analyst. They were afraid of being gaslit, which makes sense. Wow. Later, I came to realize that he was painfully fearful of anti-Semitism, that he had also hidden his own Jewish identity in the Soviet Union where he grew up, and that he was highly conflicted and at times ashamed of his own Jewish identity. Yeah. And that makes sense because that's how the mind creates that coherence. I have to hide who I am, therefore it must be shameful in order to exist in a society that is depriving people of their human rights. Yeah, they felt there was no secure space to talk about these personal narratives of his family that he's experiencing. He had the distinct feeling that his family was both entrapped and encapsulated in a history that they could neither acknowledge nor discuss. Wow. And if you notice on my channel, I talk about and I discuss my feelings and I bring them up because I know I'm not in danger, that I'm allowed to talk about them, that it's not threatening, that I'm not in danger, even though part of me feels scared and nervous about being exposed and vulnerable in that way. Because as long as you don't have that freedom, then, like they describe it, the entrapment and being encapsulated, it's very oppressive. And not that you have to share it with everyone, but even with the people that you're closest to. And that's where the intimate relationships come into play, and being able to maintain that healthy relationship is that if you are living in terror, fear, dread, like they're describing here, and don't feel safe to describe those feelings to the person you're with or a close friend, you are cutting yourself off from them, and they notice that, and that's going to prevent intimacy. That's going to prevent close bonds, which is something that you really need and would be especially helpful. People get trapped. They get trapped in paradigms, they get trapped in ways they've always done things because that's what's kept them safe. Even when they could do more. It's blurry. Hopefully it'll refocus. I don't know. This familial cultural complex pulled this person into states of overwhelming terror and dread that they found inexplicable. And this is really amazing because this journal article is clearly explaining this. Okay. There we go. And it's providing this narrative that explains, yes, it makes sense why you feel this way. Oh, yeah. Was kicked out of school for an anti-Stalin sentiment, even as a primary school pupil. Yeah, so deeply, deeply affected. And a lot of these environments, they're still very present in lots of places around the world today. They retreated into themselves in an abject state of despair and confusion which pervaded their life. They grew up isolated and lonely, not knowing who they could trust. Very marginalized, their attachments were filled with anxiety, and they chose avoidance and withdrawal as a way of coping with betrayal and disappointment. It left them with the feeling that there was little sense of choice or agency, so ability to do something about it possible, to create their own life space or identity. So creating an identity separate from what he had known. This was complicated as his family were Communist Party members and academics who were afforded luxuries. Is that a bribe? Ooh, that sounds like fawning. Putting up with the ruling class and aligning yourself with them to not get hurt. His grandmother, an inspiring intellectual who spoke many languages and worked for the Soviet State Library in Moscow, was often asked to find quotes from the letters and texts of the two communist heroes to support party speeches and propaganda. Through her, the family gained some stability by having a good apartment in Moscow. And being able to resist some of the Stalin-approved anti-Semitism. Yeah, so the client found themselves in the United States rather bewildered with the culture once they were finally able to move. And still feeling underlying persecutory anxiety and dread of the future. So it stayed with him. Yeah. So you can leave the problems, but then the problems can stay with you. He trained as an engineer, married, and had a child. When they moved to California to work in Silicon Valley as a computer expert, so lots of money in that field, he felt this vague sense of malaise filled with dread and anxiety that brought up his memories of his Moscow years. Bleak memories that felt him feeling encapsulated and alone. Yeah, so we don't know. Their partner could have thought, oh, well, this person's a good catch. They've got a good job, they're university educated, they seem fairly presentable on the surface, but underneath there can be all of this stuff going on that there isn't even a space to talk about. And that's really going to affect their lives. And you realize, oh, what's happening here? Yeah, so they had a serious phobic reaction on a train when entering Germany when they took a trip back to Europe. Ooh, when the train stopped on the border, they began to feel a change in their state of mind and body. He described becoming dissociated and felt that time had somehow changed. He started to feel anxiety and was filled with fear and dread. Ooh. He experienced the fantasy that when the border guard came to look at his passport, he would be asked to check if he was Jewish and then would be sent to a concentration camp. So I would imagine that I would call that an intrusive thought or an intrusive image or video. And the word fantasy is curious to me, but they might be trying to use this in a technical sense. Because fantasy implies there's some kind of joy involved or desire involved. But this sounds like basically fear and dread. So this person realized that Holocaust memories which had their origins in his family's cultural complexes were impacting him in a profound way. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh. But that's the thing. These things come up later in life. After it seems like I'm stable now. Seems like I'm okay. Not okay. That's when the body says, okay, we're ready to start processing this. As we began to discuss the implications of this symptom on the train, memories of the Holocaust in the form of family narratives emerged. Well, and the person doing the therapy was filled with sadness, terror, and anxiety. So it was affecting both of them. Yeah, talked in hushed tones, fear that someone would overhear. Yeah. Yeah, that fear, it's real. It doesn't matter, even if your mind knows you're okay, it's fine. But even your mind can be distorted to think like it's not okay because the feeling is so strong. Your body's transported back to the event, so it's like a emotional flashback. Yeah, so then the therapist is getting flashbacks too of their childhood. So when the session stopped, the client got up from the couch and said, I don't understand why I keep thinking about these horrible things. It happens over and over again for no apparent reason. Will it ever stop? So this can affect a person in thinking that they're broken, that thinking that this is always going to be like this, and it can amplify the dread. So it can make the situation even worse than what it already is. Yeah, they reported that since their childhood, they were plagued by nightmares. Wow. So, and they're getting memories. And it's not clear whether they're not actually their own memories, but potentially. So they're trying to give them some shape and form. So trying to process, probably trying to pick apart what happened to them and what didn't happen to them. Because with the trauma, there can be a bit of a cloud that is surrounding the memories. And it's just difficult to access that because there can be this wall put up between you and your memories where you're protecting yourself, because as soon as the memories surface, along comes the pain, and you can't deal with that pain because you're in survival mode. Okay. So anxiety and dread that were spilling over into his everyday life. And during this time, I'm assuming during the time when the memories are starting to resurface, he was having dreams of being tortured. He appeared to be giving symbolic expression to the cultural complex related to the Holocaust. So the therapist is saying, are suggesting that the dreams are not their own experience, but they're this collective complex. Oh. So it's really not just the genetic aspect of it, it's the growing up in this environment where there is this tone where it's communicated unconsciously what's happened. It's just like it's so heavy and tense. And you're living in that. So I'm going to just flip that and say, imagine if that's possible, we can also have a reality where there is this beautiful light and joy and peace in our lives that pervades our lives. And so this emotional space that we inhabit and interact with others, it can have different tones to it. Yeah. They were expected to split up any feeling about their Holocaust history as a citizen of the Soviet state. And there wasn't really a space to provide mourning at a personal and collective level for their dead relatives, so people that they knew. The analysis became a space in which personal and collective mourning could begin to unfold. So they're referring to here how as you heal yourself, you're healing others because you're affecting that collective space. And what's really interesting, that what comes up here is it's very evident and obvious that there is this collective space. There's a lot that isn't said, and this communication that is happening non-verbally. In fact, most of the communication, most of what's being transmitted here is non-verbally. And so if this trauma can be transmitted non-verbally, beautiful, amazing things can also be transmitted non-verbally as well. So there's that potential. So there's not just the dark aspect, there's the light aspect of it too. For example, the beautiful, incredible, kind, amazing person you are can be communicated and transmitted through more than just words, through less words, just through your being. And that is going to impact others. Within the relationship of analysis, the primary function is to hold and contain the emerging affective states within the analytical couple and to provide a safe space within which the different states of mind, infantile, sensory, imaginal, and affective, can be elaborated and reflected upon. So there's lots of stuff going on. So emotional flashbacks, there is flashbacks within the body, there is memories, there's a sensory aspect. I'm not sure what infantile means. Imaginal is that imagination. There's just like a whole host of stuff that's going on here. Yeah, so there's this authentic person-to-person connection. And so this is affecting really both people in the relationship. And yeah, there's a new identity that is emerging here. So this is part of the healing, having this new identity. These became transcendent moments and created security in that space where memory, thought, and image can be elaborated. Okay, so the memories, the feelings, the thoughts aren't as scary because they don't have to be hidden. So this is the protective mechanism. It dulls. It has to suppress the thoughts, the emotions, anything that is reflective of an autonomous, authentic being that can make choices, that can criticize something. Every sense of autonomy and authenticity has to be suppressed to survive. And because it's not safe. Because if you have any kind of identity and you start thinking and you start speaking up, you're not going to be able to continue to have that identity. So, and that's, yeah, we can link that back to that fear of being authentic and vulnerable and see how this impacts all of us. We all have ancestors, most likely who were affected by very traumatic events. And so this is something that we are working through, all of us. So they're creating within the therapy a space where the authentic thoughts and feelings and the reality of what's happened is allowed to come up and is allowed to be there. Because it's not the pain itself that is creating the problem, it's the suppression of the pain that is conflicting with the ability to be an autonomous person. Yeah, there was a shared recognition of their pain, isolation, and trauma, and as the analysis progressed, he became better able to tolerate these effects within himself. Yeah. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that as there was a space to express what was happening to this person, and create this coherent narrative around what was happening and why they were experiencing these flashbacks, these dreams, these somatic experiences that seemed very much out of context. Being able to analyze and create this cohesive story, being able to not live in a state of fear that they're not allowed to express that, because when we can't express that to others, we also can't express that to ourselves. So being able to be authentic and honest within ourselves is probably the most important thing. It's creating this coherence within yourself. And this other person is creating a safe space that allows this person to be able to recognize and fully feel safe enough to fully feel that within themselves. So this is really a reparation of the relationship of this person with their true authentic self. Yeah. Oh, okay. So the therapist and the person who wrote this is discussing the transference, which we talked about earlier, and it's coming back now. His transference during the first phase of his analysis was filled with suspicion, dismissiveness, and avoidance. And he constructed the fantasy that I was probably a deluded Trotskyist. Oh, wow. Oh, this person was suffering so much, but they still came to therapy and were suffering in the therapy. And that's how strong that trauma is coming up within them. But there was a part of them that recognized they really needed to work through this. Wow, it's so interesting that I picked this journal article that it showed up like this, because I can see how this relates to the videos that I've released recently. Especially the one where this anger was coming up for me and I was projecting it onto my boss. So it can be related to our own lives in various different ways. It doesn't have to be the exact same scenario for you to be able to look at this and say, wow, okay, I can, and see how this affected me. As the analysis progressed and his narrative took on more coherence, meaning, and value, avoidance and dismissiveness gave way to a deeper openness to both affective and imaginal experience. His dreams began to take on more coherence, and his dreams began to take on more coherence, and he began to remember them with greater frequency and intensity. Because the self is like, I need to be liberated from this. The body says, I can't take this anymore. The mind says, I can't take this anymore. And it's going to act out. And it's acting out in like these crazy dreams this person is happening. Pay attention, pay attention. I need healing. Pay attention to me. That separated part of yourself that needs to be let go and freed and needs to be authentic. It's like, don't hold me in this box anymore. Oh, so they describe a dream. I'm not going to read it because it could be triggering. Yeah, so they described how the dream reflected their person was beginning to feel a sense of agency, and they were beginning to listen to themselves. And we often don't give ourselves permission to listen to ourselves. His relationship to me as the therapist, as well as to his internal world, was transforming. And he was now able to risk that his cries and screams had a meaning and that would be responded to. Okay, so we're going to stop there for now, and we're going to have to continue in the next video. So there's going to be a part 2.